This is the first program in a two-part series covering the disassembly and assembly techniques for the Revolution engine. This program features the 2003 Revolution engine. Though the components in future model years may share similar design, always refer to the service manual for the year and model of the motorcycle you are working on for complete instructions, specifications, and warnings. In addition, service bulletins may also provide you with information concerning part, product, or procedural changes. Servicing the Revolution engine can be broken down into two areas: transmission and lower end, and top end and cylinders. In this program, we will be presenting an overview of the procedures for servicing the lower end and transmission. In the next program, we will present the top end and cylinder procedures. To service the lower end, the engine must be removed from the frame. Review Pht 163 for details on this procedure. The cooling system should be drained using the drain ports in the cylinder block, and the oil should be drained from the crankcase. We will begin by mounting the engine into the stand using the Harley-Davidson engine cradle attachment. The cradle attaches directly to the engine with metric fasteners. The disassembly begins with the removal of the inspection cover, followed by the 14 alternator cover fasteners. Use the removal and torque sequence in the service manual. All of the cover bolts are the same length. 2 gasket alignment dowels are installed to guide the cover during removal. These pins should be on opposite sides of the cover. The alternator stator cover removal installation tool is mounted to the cover using the 2 inspection cover screws. Turn the hand screw in to pull the cover away from the cases. Most of the resistance is from the magnetic fields of the rotor. The alignment pins can be removed along with the gasket. These formed gaskets should not be reused or used with sealants. With the alternator cover removed, we move on to the clutch cover. Use the torque sequence in the manual when removing these bolts. The clutch cover fasteners are the same length as the alternators. To remove the clutch, first remove the retaining ring followed by the lifter guide. Next, remove the retaining ring on the end of the input shaft. This ring is to be replaced after each use. Next, remove the oil retaining clip from the clutch hub. This ring is removed to provide clearance for the holding tool. If you need to disassemble the clutch friction disc pack, loosen the 5 lifter plate bolts 1 turn. To remove the clutch hub nut, you will need to install the clutch hub holder. You may need to rotate the engine to align the tool. Remember to always rotate the engine in a counterclockwise direction to prevent damage. When installing the tool, make sure that the crankcase pin matches the hole in the tool. The tool is bolted to the engine's cases using the clutch cover bolts. The clutch hub nut is retained with Loctite. You can use an air impact wrench to remove the nut, or heat the nut with a propane torch to break the Loctite down for removal. The clutch hub nut uses right-handed threads and is a single-use fastener that must be replaced. The holder can now be removed and the clutch assembly slid off the shaft along with the thrust washer behind the clutch. In this section, we will highlight the procedures for servicing the clutch. Always refer to your service manual for complete instructions, specifications, and warnings. Remove the clutch pack and loosen the 5 retaining bolts evenly, 2 to 3 turns at a time, to release the spring pressure and prevent the plate from breaking. The clutch uses 9 identical friction plates and 8 identical steel plates. Do not clean the friction plates in solvent or wipe them with rags to prevent contamination. New friction plates must be soaked in 20W50 engine oil for 10 minutes before assembly. Refer to your service manual for specifications for these 6 inspections that should be performed as part of the clutch inspection. Notching of the slots in the shell or the hub can interfere with the engagement or release of the clutch. The clutch uses a damper spring to provide a smooth engagement and release. A flat steel spring seat is installed on the hub, followed by a curved spring. The spring is installed so that the outer edge is raised up from the seat. Install the first friction plate, paying close attention to the centering of the plate around the spring. Then install the remaining plates, alternating between steel and the friction plates. All of the steel plates should face in the same direction, either rounded or flat side up. We will demonstrate clutch assembly in this section before continuing with disassembly. To assemble the pack, first locate the alignment marks in the hub and the pressure plate. The hub and pressure plate may not fully engage if these marks are not aligned as shown. Install the springs and the lifter plate and start the bolts. To assemble the clutch pack into the shell, first install the distance collar into the shell bearing with the collar on the inside. Now insert the clutch disc alignment tool through the collar from the primary side of the shell. Slide the clutch pack into the shell, aligning the tabs in the slots. Note that the top plate's tabs are positioned into the special slots in the shell, as shown here. The pressure plate bolts should be tightened in a crossing pattern to prevent the loading of the release plate and possible damage. The alignment tool can now be removed. When installing the clutch onto the engine, make sure that the thrust washer is installed on the input shaft with the reduced diameter facing the engine bearing. The drive gear on the shell is a zero-lash design that uses a thin spring-loaded gear to eliminate gear lash. When installing the shell, you will need to load this gear. Use a punch and these holes to move the gear until the shell slides into full engagement with the crankshaft gear. With the clutch holding tool installed, you can torque the new clutch hub nut and install the retaining ring. Install the oil retaining ring after removing the holding tool. Getting back to the lower end service, disassembly continues with the removal of 3 bolts holding the oil pump to the cases. Also remove the oil dipstick at this time. If you intend to remove the balancer shaft for service, you should loosen the bolt holding the gear to the balancer now. Use a 1/2 inch extension on a breaker bar to hold the crankshaft at the oil pump drive socket. Loosen the balancer drive gear bolt. If you are not servicing the balancer, do not loosen this bolt. Now is a good time to loosen the rotor bolt. Rotate the engine in the stand and remove the oil pan bolts. Note the location of the ground strap for assembly. All of the fasteners are the same length as the clutch and the alternator cover. With the sump removed, you can proceed to remove the oil pickup and the baffle plate. On the primary side of the engine, loosen but do not remove the bearing retainer plate fasteners. Now install the transmission assembly retainer tool onto the input shaft and attach it to the lower engine case as shown. On the alternator side of the engine, loosen all 4 output shaft seal bolts, but only remove the 2 that attach the seal plate to the upper case. When removing the case fasteners, refer to the chart in the service manual for the correct sequence. 2 of the 19 bolts are located on the upper case side. The remainder are removed from the bottom. You can use a soft mallet to loosen the case seal, but do not pry on the sealing surfaces. The transmission shafts will be retained in the case and will add considerable weight. Use assistance to lift off the lower case. In this section of the program, we will present an overview of the transmission service procedures. Always refer to the appropriate service manual for complete instructions, specifications, and warnings. Inspect the retaining pin on the bearings and the holes in the crankcase. These pins position the bearings, and if they are damaged, the bearing will need to be replaced. Remove the 2 fasteners from the seal housing and remove the output shaft and inspect the retaining pins on the bearings. Currently, the only components of the transmission shafts that are serviceable is the output shaft seal and the bearings. All other components can only be serviced as a full shaft. Do not disassemble the shafts unless components are made available. Refer to current parts information for availability. These 2 special tools will be needed along with a 30 mm socket with a maximum OD of 39.6 mm. A socket may need to be machined to this specification. To disassemble, first pry the lock ring out. With the locking tool held in a vise, remove and discard the output flange nut. This nut must be replaced on assembly. With the nut removed, use a puller to remove the flange and seal. To assemble the shaft, position the seal over the flange and then hold the assembly in the locking tool while you thread on the old nut. Use the old nut to draw the flange down on the shaft until it seats. Remove the old nut and install a new O-ring seal and nut. Then torque the nut to specification. Install the retainer into the bore and then use the special tool to crimp the plate using the puller to crimp the plate. This procedure can be done with the engine in the frame. The procedure is detailed in the service manual. Under no circumstances should you use a hammer, as you will damage the bearing. Next, we will continue with the removal of the shift forks and drum. Begin by removing the neutral switch and the input shaft bearing plate. Use a drift to pull the shift fork shaft through the case. Never use a hammer to force the shaft or the cases can be damaged. The first step in removing the shift drum is to install the shift mechanism detent retractor. Position the tool, engaging the alignment pin in the case hole, and slide the shift fork shaft into place. Position the pin on the tool's arm on top of the shifter gliding part, as shown here, and tighten the brass thumb screw. If the pin is under the gliding part, the pin on the detent arm will be bent and the arm will need to be replaced. Rotate the lever of the tool and tighten the black thumb screw into the hole in the tool base to hold the retracted arm. The shift drum shaft can now be slid out and the shift drum lifted out of the case. To service the shift shaft and seal, you first remove the outer snap ring, which is zinc, followed by the seal. Now you can remove the inner black snap ring and pull the shaft out. As the shaft clears the actuator, the inner springs will move the arms out of alignment with the case hole. When installing the arm, first engage the splines on the shaft with the arm. You can then pull the arm over and push the shaft into the case until the inner ring groove is exposed. Carefully position both springs while installing the shaft. Install the black inner snap ring and then the seal using the special driver. With the seal in place, finish the assembly with the zinc snap ring. Next, we will present the procedures for the balancer shaft. Always refer to the service manual for current procedures and specifications. Remove the balancer drive gear bolt and discard. This is a one-time use fastener and must be replaced. If you did not loosen the bolt prior to splitting the cases, you should assemble the cases using the 4 main case bolts so that you can hold the crankshaft to break the bolt free. Gently pry the gear off the shaft to gain access to the outer retaining ring. With the ring removed, thread the end of the removal tool into the balancer. Rotate the balancer to prevent binding and support it during removal. Remove the tool and the bearing and twist the balancer to remove. To remove the outer bearing, you must first remove the retaining ring on the inside of the bearing and then slide the removal insert through the bearing from the alternator side of the bearing. Install the puller from the clutch side and pull the race out of the case. The inner races must also be replaced. These 2 special tools are used to service the bearings. Position the end cap over the end of the shaft, and then fit the lower puller half with the pin hole over the bearing. Fit the pin of the push screw into the hole and install the upper half, and then slide the connecting collar down to hold the assembly. Turn the screw clockwise to remove the bearing. The inner races are different and should not be interchanged. Lubricate the bearing races as specified in the service manual during installation. To install the gear side inner race, fit the installation piece over the forcing screw of the balancer bearing installation tool. Thread the screw of the tool into the shaft and then turn the large nut to press the race onto the shaft until it seats. To install the new alternator side inner race, use a press with the installation tool to install the race. Remember that the two inner races are different parts and are not interchangeable. Use the installation tool and drive the new bearing into the alternator side. The bearing number must face the driver. Drive it in until the retaining ring groove is visible. Then install the new retaining rings, both in the inboard and outboard bores. Install the balancer in the cases and thread the tapered guide from the installation tool set into the shaft. Slide the bearing into place with the numbers facing out and use the driver to seat the bearings in the case until the outer retaining ring is exposed. Install the outer retaining ring and gear. Start a new bolt to hold the gear. Final torquing of the bolt will be done after the cases have been assembled, so the crankshaft can be used to hold the gear. Anytime the cases are separated, you must replace the main bearing inserts. This can be done without disassembling the top end or removing the crankshaft. Refer to the service manual for current specifications. To determine what size bearings will be needed, look for the size codes on the crankshaft counterweight on the clutch side. ALT refers to the alternator side. The first letter is the bearing size for the main journal on the alternator side. The next two letters are for the connecting rods, and the last letter is the size code for the clutch side journal. If the journals appear to be worn, they should be measured and compared to the manual specifications for sizing of bearings. To remove the upper insert of the alternator side, first remove the rotor bolt using the holding tool and an air impact wrench. Only use the air impact wrench for removal. Have an assistant insert a pry bar into the rotor bolt hole and lift up. Then use a small screwdriver and push the bearing to rotate it out of the case. Lubricate the new bearing, and while lifting the crankshaft, slide it into the case, aligning the tab on the bearing with the case notch. Never touch the bearing surface of a non-oil bearing with your fingers, as you will etch the bearing surface. Repeat the procedure on the clutch side using an extension in the end of the crankshaft to lift up while pushing the bearing out and inserting a new one. Replace the lower case bearings with the new bearing to match the upper case bearing. We are now ready to demonstrate the reassembly of the lower end. Always refer to your service manual for current specifications. We will begin with the shift drum. Install the shift detent retraction tool, which we demonstrated earlier. Support the shift drum with the nylon strap from the tool and lower the drum into position and insert the shaft. Do not force the shaft. Remove the retraction tool and install the substitute shift lever to check operation. The shift fork with the offset fingers is on the clutch side. The fork with the shield is in the center, and the straight finger fork is on the alternator side. Position the forks in the case, aligning the pins with the drum. The outside forks face the output shaft. The center fork faces the input shaft. Insert the shaft. Install the neutral switch and loosely install the bearing retainer for the input shaft bearing. Apply a small dab of Harley-Davidson RTV case sealer around the output shaft bearing retainer hole on the clutch side to retain the bearing assembly. Position the output shaft into the case, aligning the shift fork and the pin in both bearings with the holes in the case. You will feel the pin drop in, and you will not be able to rotate the bearing race. Align the holes on the output shaft seal with the case and install the 2 bolts finger tight. Install the input shaft aligning the shift forks and the pins on both bearings with the case. Install the assembly retaining tool onto the input shaft and attach it to the case. Using the shift lever, rotate the input shaft and shift the transmission through all of the gears to test operation. When finished, check to make sure that the bearing pins are still properly aligned with their mating case holes. Position the balancer gear so that the alignment mark is pointed towards the center of the crankshaft journal and insert the counterbalancer alignment pin through the case and into the balancer weight. Thoroughly lubricate all bearings and all other areas identified in the manual. Verify that the crankshaft is at TDC by inserting the crankshaft locking pin. Use the crankshaft retainer if you need to rotate the crankshaft more than a small amount. Remember to only turn the engine in a counterclockwise direction. Install the crankcase alignment dowels in the upper case and check that the dipstick is removed and crankshaft locking pin is installed. Also confirm that the upper crankcase input shaft bearing retainer has some play in it so that it does not interfere with the bearing during installation. Apply VRSC crankcase sealant to the lower case half. Use the diagram in the manual to guide your application. Use only a small bead, 1 millimeter in diameter, of sealant to avoid contamination. With the help of an assistant, lower the case into position. When the balancer and crankshaft gear are close to engagement, remove the balancer alignment pin and hand position the gears into alignment. If you do not remove the pin, the gear's timing will be off. Remove the alignment pins and hand thread all 19 case bolts into position. Use the service manual to identify lengths and torque sequences. The torque sequence starts with tightening all 19 fasteners to 25 Newton meters or 18.4 foot-pounds in the specified sequence. Now, back off the 4 main bearing bolts 1 full turn in the correct sequence. Next, retorque these 4 bolts to 15 Newton meters or 11 foot-pounds. Using a torque angle gauge, tighten each bolt 90 degrees further in the sequence specified. Next, remove the input shaft retainer and torque the input bearing retainer bolts and the 4 output shaft seal fasteners to the specified torques. Install a new oil pan baffle and an oil pickup followed by the oil pan. Torque the oil pan bolts in a crossing pattern with the ground strap attached to the corner bolt at the rear of the clutch side. To torque the balancer drive gear, hold the crankshaft using the oil pump drive with the breaker bar and extension. Now is also a good point to torque the rotor bolt to specification while holding the crankshaft with the breaker bar. When installing the alternator cover, use a new gasket held in place by the alignment dowels. Using the cover removal tool as a guide, position the cover and back the tool out until the cover seats. Use the diagram in the manual when torquing the cover fasteners to properly seal the gasket. Install the thrust washer on the input shaft with the undercut facing the engine and assemble the clutch as we showed earlier in the program. With the clutch installed, you can fit the new O-rings on the oil pump and install it and torque the 3 fasteners to specification. Finally, install the clutch cover using a new gasket and torque the fasteners using the sequence shown in the manual. All that remains is to install the engine into the frame as demonstrated in PhD 163. This concludes this PhD training program. As with all programs, the procedures shown are subject to revision. Always refer to the most current service information when servicing the engine.